Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Séverine Martin. I'm the director of Columbia's undergraduate programs in Paris, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to the 8th event in our series of conversations, Entre Nous. Entre Nous is a collaboration between Columbia Global Centers Paris, the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, and the American Library in Paris. The aim of this series is to put in conversation scholars, writers, journalists, and artists from around the world, and through these dialogues across geographies and cultures, create a sense of intimacy, hence the entre nous, and connection to questions that are relevant across the globe. As the Columbia Global Center Paris begins to celebrate Black History Month, it is my great honor to introduce today's speakers, Kaiama L. and Maboula Soumahoro. Kaiama, you are a professor of French and Africana Studies at Barnard College and Columbia University. Through your scholarship on Haitian and Caribbean literature, your analysis of postcolonial feminism, and your study of representations of womanhood in Caribbean prose fiction, you have mapped an incredible intellectual cartography of the Afro-Atlantic. This work has earned you numerous distinctions from the Heim Foundation, the National Endowment of the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and the Fulbright Foundation. In addition to being this incredible scholar, a remarkable professor and mentor to your students, you have also dedicated your time to several translation projects, amongst which the translation of Maboula Soumahoro's book, Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, réflexions sur une identité noire, published at La Découverte in 2020. This book, which received a special mention from the Maryse Condé Literary Prize, was translated by you into English as Black is the Journey, Africana the Name, published at Polity in 2021. I now turn to Maboula, who I'm so honored to have with us today. Maboula, you are an associate professor in the English department of the University of Tours, a specialist in the field of Africana Studies. Your work is known both in France and in the United States, where you have taught in several prestigious universities. You were recently a fellow at the Villa Albertine, and you are a pioneer in shaping discussions around race and diaspora studies on both sides of the Atlantic. Beyond your academic research, you are also a committed activist. And as I told my students today, I personally love the way you define yourself as an Afrofeminist. I will end my remarks just by saying that it is stimulating to have this conversation on Blackness and Black identity today, as we celebrate the 220th anniversary of the first abolition of slavery in France. Thank you both, and I look forward to this evening's conversation.
Thank you very much, Séverine, for this warm welcome and this introduction. And thank you, Andrew, Samantha, Sam, IT, and hello, Dr. Glover. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure to be in conversation with you, privately or publicly, but always in a scholarly manner.
Always in a very scholarly manner. And thank you. I want to say, Séverine, I've never been directly addressed in an introduction before, and I like that. I think that's just a fabulous style, and it really is an invitation into the conversation that feels very warm and generous. So thank you for that very special address in your introduction. It was lovely. So Maboula and I, we realized very shortly before this event that we hadn't really sorted out a plan, because we've gotten a bit cocky because we chat so much, as Maboula said, privately and in public, that it seems very natural, these kinds of occasions. But nonetheless, we did figure out some way in that will be contained and we hope makes sense in the spirit of the dialogic, in the spirit of conversation. So I'll ask a question to Maboula, she'll ask a question to me, and then what we thought we'd do is go through a few keywords that the two of us have been thinking about very pointedly together for a project that we are working on that looks towards the future. So I will start with a very softball question for Maboula. Maboula, entre nous, tell us about your book. But more specifically, if you could tell us about where it came from, and what was the moment when you thought to yourself, I can write this story, and why that moment happened when it did.
Okay, so thank you for this first question, which sounds like a softball question, but which is not. I'll say it. No, but it's a good way to introduce the conversation, because some of the things that I mentioned, I'm sure we can draw on in the upcoming conversation. So I think that when I think about the genealogy of the book, the writing of this book and the publishing of this book, I have to go over, that takes me back over 20 years prior. And it's a book that is really the fruit, the outcome, the results of peregrinations, which is a word that I use in the book, of traveling, of circulations, of movements, and of discovery, multiple discoveries. So it's a book that can only come, that could in my life only be published in 2020. It could not be published in 2000 when I was still a doctoral student, before I met you, Kaiama. It was not a book that I could have published before the defense of my PhD dissertation. That was back in 2008. It was not a book that I could have published after securing a tenured position within French academia, and that happened in 2009. So all these chronological signposts, guideposts, they all led me to 2019, the year when I wrote the book, and the publication of 2020. So when I speak of a journey, it's really the book is my attempt at making sense of those peregrinations that truly scholarly speaking, they began in 1999, which is the year when I first participated in an exchange program student program in New York. And this is when I went and studied at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. And this is when I met Edouard Glissant, who was still alive and teaching at the time. This is the academic year when I met Colin Palmer, a specialist of the African diaspora, a historian. This is the year that I also spent studying at Hunter College at the Black and Puerto Rican Studies department. And I took my first classes in African history and Caribbean cultures. So the academic year 1999-2000 was really pivotal in the evolution of my scholarship. But that's only about 20 years ago. There is another story that had begun before 1999, and that is the personal story. And that story begins on the African continent, in West Africa, in the Ivory Coast, which is the birthplace of my parents and my ancestor. And my parents migrated to France in the mid to late 1960s. They established themselves in France, and they had a bunch of children in Paris, France. And I'm among those children, and I was born in Paris, France. So if I make the connection between the scholarly narrative and the personal narrative, I immediately begin this narration that unfolded in Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, in the Ivory Coast, on the African continent, in Paris, France, in Europe, and then in the Americas with New York and the United States in particular, right? So this need for me to make sense or to look back on this Black Atlantic of mine, on my personal trajectory, on my trajectory anchored in academia, both in France and in the United States. led me or gave me the strength, the confidence to publish Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, because there was no need to secure, no longer a need to secure a PhD. There was no longer a need to, I don't know, perhaps strengthen or more readily accept my, double or triple identities, the French citizenship, the Ivorian citizenship, my relationship to both France and the Ivory Coast as nation states, my relationship to the African continent and the European continent. There was no need either to gain the PhD and to gain the tenured position. So I could at last be free and say and write what I really wanted to write. So I think this book is really the, a first taste of a more total freedom for me. So this is what I can say about the book.
So just to, I'm going to push just a little bit, and I know then you have a question, but just to say, so you've given us, as I asked, the origin story of the book. In case there's, by some miracle, someone out there here who hasn't yet read it, can you maybe give just like a brief summary of what they'll find? No spoilers, but just what's this book about, more explicitly?
So the book is actually, to me, to this day, it's still difficult to describe. I don't know in which category it's supposed to be, put in. I don't know. I don't know if it's a memoir. I don't know if it's a reflection on Africana Studies, and particularly on the notion of the African diaspora, which is the notion that I investigated in my scholarly career. But it's really a reflection on what we could call the Black Atlantic. That is to say, the relation between the African, European, and American continents since the modern times, since modern history. What has this unprecedented encounter, how this encounter steeped in, in violence, how this encounter has prompted so many displacements, voluntary or, involuntary, how this encounter has produced, political, intellectual, religious, even traditions that I find myself anchored in to this day. So the book is really trying to find a balance between the personal and the more general. It is trying to make sense of the scholarship that has been produced on the topic, but it is also interested in reflecting on how the individual is also part of this story. So my will was to place myself within this narrative, within those traditions, and try to begin to explore how what can be sometimes understood as very abstract, as very past, as very, immaterial things can and do have an impact on somebody's life, concrete impact. It's not only about literature. It's not only about religion or spirituality. It's not about laws. It's not only about, great events. It is also my life. And it is also an attempt for me to take or to use my personal experience as my object of study in light of the scholarship that has been produced on the topic. So this is what the book is about. It's partly personal and it's partly, academic and general.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you. My turn?
Your turn. My softball, right? Okay.
Yeah. So Kaiama Glover, I would like to talk, and I would like us to because it's many of us tonight, to talk about your approach to translation. What is translation to you generally? How do you approach the topic? How do you practice translation? Perhaps you can talk a little more, a little bit about what you've translated before and what eventually made you accept my, request to translate me. I have to say that I did impose you. It was not a battle, but I said I know, and I know exactly who is going to be my translator if she accepts. And it was very important for me to have you on board because of trust, because of my knowledge of your scholarship, because of knowing you for so many years, and because of your mastery of obviously the English language, but also your knowledge of the French and the Francophone background. So you were my first choice. But what made you accept, this request of mine?
Okay, so that was a lot of a question.
That was a softball.
All right, touche. So the easy answer is because it was you, and that I'm pretty explicit about in my translator's note, that
yes,
that it just made all sense to me given the longue durée of our relationship, my admiration for you as a person, as a thinker, as a scholar, and then also my desire to know you through this book and through figuring out how to translate you into another context. And, when Séverine was doing the introductions, she said at one point, in addition to your scholarship, you are a translator. And it struck me because, translating, it's part of my scholarship. It's increasingly part of how I understand history, culture, context, society. So it's not so much a task as it is an exploration or an inquiry in and of itself, let's say. And so the text to be translated, in this case, Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, this to me is just an opportunity, right? To engage with the work, to learn from the work, and then yes, to offer the work through perhaps the filter of my own reflection to a different audience. So yeah, I think that I've learned this. I was going to say I'm not a professional translator. That's not true. I am not someone who set out to translate. I'm someone who, through my interest in the Francophone Caribbean, in the French Black Atlantic, came to translation and discovered how incredibly enriching the act of translating could be to my own thinking as a scholar, right? So something that's baked so intimately into my professional approach in other dimensions, be it research and reading, be it pedagogy, be it collaboration. Translation is a pillar of all of that. And then, in the past, I started off translating primarily prose fiction, primarily Haitian prose fiction. In fact, I think my first three translations were Haitian novels. And then since then moved into nonfiction, first with Françoise Vergès's Racism, Capitalism, Feminism. 3 terms, I think I've botched the order, but you know what I'm talking about. And then you, and then Black is the Journey. And differently to any other translation I've done, this has been the most conversational, dialogic, fluid, continuous, non-finite, all those things. Yeah, and that has been a singular experience of translation. So, I've translated non-living authors, I've translated living authors, I've translated living authors to whom I said, well, here's the manuscript, give me your notes, I'll fix them, and then we'll give it to the publisher. But this translation, this experience of translating Le Triangle et l'Hexagone has been like a step in an ongoing conversation, in a journey, I guess, that for us stretches back to a long time, 2 decades, and has surfaced in so many different iterations across those 2 decades. Edited volumes, co-teaching, coffees, films, chats, whatever. And this just makes so much sense as another building block in something that then will have new life because of this translation collaboration. So did I hit all the...
Yes, you did.
There were layers upon layers.
No, it was very rich. I have perhaps one last point that was not planned, so you don't have to answer because it was not part of what we. But just in case, I insisted on the title. I chose my title and I translated my own title, and you were, gracious enough to accept it. But now I'm curious, as I was hearing you speak, what would have been, if you have thought of it before, what would have been your title of the book?
So, and I love your question. You're horrible to do this to me on the spot, but I love it. So my first instinct, and it would have been wrong, I think. My first instinct would have to have it be the triangle and the hexagon with a smaller subtitle that was something like a transatlantic journey or a transatlantic conversation. The reason, okay, I think it might have been a mistake is because I think that title would have been a function of my deep knowledge of the context. That would have been a hindrance, right? My presumption that these two constructs would have some resonance in the Anglosphere, whereas they might not. We've talked about this before. There's a knowledge of like the triangular trade. That's the geometric shape that gets put on diaspora for Anglophones. But the hexagon is a foreign term, and I've seen it questioned in other contexts. Nonetheless, as a translator personally, I do like the idea of making the reader do a little bit of work. Because of the public that Polity was going for, a subtitle didn't necessarily make sense. To me, the subtitle would have been the hint at what the triangle and the hexagon were meant to symbolize. But as a, and that does speak to my translating practice. I think part of what I hope to do and to intervene is to not exactly split the difference between consumption, ease of consumption, and opacity of the source text, but some reminder to the, as they call it, the target language audience that you're entering a different territory. This is not for you to just consume without imagining there's a context that's different to your own. So for that reason alone, that's where I would have started the conversation about a title.
Thank you so much. I asked you this question, but as you were speaking, that came to me, so that wasn't planned. But I love the idea that even in your own, what you would have, gone for naturally, there was still journey.
Oh yeah. Well, because the book is movement. The book is physical displacement. Obviously, that's key, and that the hitting of the nodal points of the diaspora, fine, but there's such a journey that's happening on an intellectual level and on an emotional level that is being offered, that it seemed, I love the word journey. It would have maybe, I might have chosen travel, but that journey is better. Journey has the component of, I don't know, has the emotional component, I think, that's key to understanding the book. So I'll use that to segue into the second part of our very organized conversation, which is, so Maboula and I have been working on a project with the tentative title Untranslatable. And it has a subtitle or what have you, which actually, what's the subtitle? It's a good subtitle, I think.
Yes, it is.
What is it? Untranslatable Keywords to Black Expression Toward the Human and the Free.
Yes.
So it's long. It may get, but that's what we've been playing around with. And the way we're playing around with, I'm going to let Maboula tell a little bit the origin story of the hearing the trial, that what I'm talking about. But the idea that we came up with was a desire to really think about translation as an unsettled space of aspiration, with the knowledge and the acceptance of the knowledge that there cannot be an absolute transparency in this translation, right? And that the journey and the joy of it is the attempt and the kind of the conversation that's generated in the effort to understand across languages. And then we've been expanding that outward to think, well, across what other media are we interested in translation or the obstacles to translation? So that's where we began. But maybe, so before the keywords, maybe you could tell, if you don't mind, that really how we got to untranslatable.
Exactly. We were trying to, we had decided to collaborate on this topic, and we were just exchanging ideas and brainstorming together. And what I told, or what I shared with Kaiama, was some news reports that I had seen on TV as I was in Atlanta, Georgia, when the trial of the killers of Ahmaud Arbery was taking place. And this news report was following Ahmaud Arbery's mother. And so if we look at this, I don't know, if we approach this, tragic story, we're immediately in, 21st century United States. We're in the South. We're in Georgia. We are in the former land of the Confederates. We are in the, I don't know, we go back to the Civil War. We go back to chattel slavery, land of plantations, fierce fights for the end of segregation and all these things. That's the general context. And then in 2021, because that was the, around November of 2021, we have this new moment, what can be seen as a new moment, which in this case was the trial of the murderers of this young African-American men. That could be seen as progress, a trial, people standing trial for this public killing, for this present-day lynching of this young man. So we can approach, this entire context, historically, what has happened, as I said, slave trade, slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, segregation, Jim Crow, fight for segregation. And then today talks of, for decades now, but talks of police violence, the treatment and mistreatment of Black bodies, state violence on Black bodies, and white individuals exercising their rights, their dominance, their supremacy over those Black bodies, right? So that's very abstract. That's the things that we investigate, that we work on, that we teach, that we pass on, that we analyze. So when I'm watching this report, there is a moment when there's a focus on Ahmaud Arbery's mother. And it is the morning when she enters the courtroom and she speaks to the journalists filming her. And she explains that today she's going to be strong enough to watch the video of the killing of her son, that she has never watched entirely the video, but that now time has passed, the son has been buried, that the murderers are on trial, and that it's time for her to muster the strength to watch this video on, in the courtroom. So there's, the camera is set on Ahmaud Arbery's face in the courtroom, and the woman really sits, very dignified. We hear the sound of the video in the background, but the camera is set on the mother. And she's wearing a mask, and you cannot see much of her facial expressions, but she seems to keep her composure. She's okay, or she's at least standing or bearing this violence. And then at some point, when you hear the gunshots, and we know the end of the story, when you hear the gunshots and she knows that this is the moment when her son died, she sorts of, to me, she lost it. There's something that came out. She couldn't keep her composure, even though her son has been long buried, even though the demise of her son and the brutal killing has been a reality for so long, right? There is this lingering pain that comes to the fore. And at that moment, she makes a sound. She makes a sound. It's not a word. It's not it's not my God, oh my God. Or she just does something like she was punched in the stomach. There's something very physical and something that was within her that came out. And to me, that is precisely the untranslatable. The untranslatable. That is to say, something that has no sound, no word. Oh, how can I say? That can be uttered, that can express the depth of the pain, and that can express also the complexity and the depth of that history, of that traditional killing, of those experiences. How do you write them? So do you publish another article or another book on, police violence, or on, white citizens' violence, and how they have had for many centuries had the right to chase, bodies of color and to, murder them? and analyze the why, the whys and the how and the locations? Or can you understand all that in the sound produced by that bereaved mother at that moment? This is the untranslatable. This is how can we write to render the pain that was expressed at that very moment. And that goes beyond the very killing of Ahmaud Arbery itself. That was already something. What did he say? What did he not say? What did he do? How did he, I don't know, how did he carry himself? Even though we have the images, but how can we render that? How can we make justice to that? And that to me is the difficulty of translation. Even in our scholarship, what we're trying to do is to render something that will always have its limits. Its limits. We cannot describe in words the behavior of that mother at that very moment. Right? We can use statistics and say, that percentage of people have been killed in those conditions. That's not, there was the moment. So this is how we, pursued the conversation with Kaiama, but I wanted, I didn't know if I was clear enough, but I shared, my understanding of that moment, and we drew from that to, delve into the, translation and untranslatability and what we're trying to express.
And I will just emphasize or put a fine point on where we decided we could intervene while doing honor to the notion of untranslatability were in a couple of ways. One, to accept and amplify process over objective or destination or goal. Yeah. And so part of this project that we're working on is the backstage is the front stage. we want to be transparent about the relationship, the development of the conversation, and the things that aren't achieved, certainly. Yes. One. Two is, so Maboula and I are both comfortable writing. It's what we do for a living. It's what is our most convenient and trained way of articulating how we think, feel, imagine, or what have you. But we made all sorts of promises to each other as we were developing this. And one of them was to, and one of our keywords is vulnerability, like to see how far we could push one another to do things that are not within our comfort zone in terms of embodiment, expression. And this for me was one of the lessons that came out of Maboula's book, actually, as I was translating it, as I was in the position of inhabiting her I, like the capital je, the I, and recognizing the immense risk, despite what you said about, oh, well, I already had the PhD, I had a job, I'm a grown up, nonetheless, the vulnerability that was on offer and the risk that was clear seemed to me something that we could take into this next space. Like, what can you gain from confronting the things that make you uncomfortable, and how can that be part of an offering? So we're getting it. One of our keywords was vulnerability. We're departing from our plan a bit, but that's one of the words. Yes. I don't know if you want to say a few words about vulnerability, but I'll say that this is maybe the most poignant one for me, and I think that every conversation she and we've been meeting, I don't know, every couple of weeks. Yes. That's in my head. All right, what can I try to do? What can I imagine? And that, you said in your remarks earlier, trust. Yes. What a gift. And right, like, we work with a lot of people, and to articulate how important trust is to vulnerability, how important trust is to both translating and realizing the limits of what's translatable. This too is something that's been part of the conversation for us.
But I think that one of the things that I have loved about our collaboration, I mean, this present collaboration, is the new approaches and your own reading and understanding of what I've produced. So frequently I'm surprised by some of the things you say about the text and things that I was not, perhaps capable of seeing or that I was not aware of. And that began long ago, because I do remember one of the presentations I made about what was going to be the book, but it was not the book yet. And you already said something, you spoke about courage and about being brave. And to me, I was like, what? I don't see it. I don't see this courage. I don't see this vulnerability.
Yes.
So I don't know what. But it's interesting to see, if I explore this term, perhaps being vulnerable in that instance is perhaps to my attempt to provide a more complete story, a story that is not limited to the skills that we have developed in our fields of study, right? As you said, we know how to write, we know how to research, investigate, and we can put distance between ourselves and our topic and our objects of study. So perhaps being vulnerable is to, perhaps go through the border, go beyond academia, and explore the personal trajectory within this. What those migrations, those displacements, those I don't know, types of violence, those forms of creativity, those reinventions, what have they entailed? What is it? Only something that you're passionate I'm trying to escape myself. Is it only something that I enjoy teaching and reading about? Or can it also be about some type of healing, and not healing the easy way, not the very, it's time to heal. No, healing through understanding. After all, what brought my parents to the Ivory Coast, from the Ivory Coast to France? After all, where are we going to bury one another? After all, where are we all going to, give birth? In what location? After all, what are we going to share with one another, tell one another, not tell, in light of those particular circumstances? Perhaps that's the vulnerability, but that, to me, that was more experienced as a sense of urgency. Because as if it was the moment in life when those questions, come back to the surface. That you're younger, you're traveling, you're eager, you're doing everything. And then at some point, you have to pause. At some point, what is your legacy? At some point, for you to envision or imagine a legacy, you have to reflect on your ascendancy. So how does the story begin? And how does it continue? And how will it continue with or without you? And so that's, yes, that's the vulnerability, taking stock and accepting the fact that this is not only history, that's your story. That is your story, and who are you? But you can be comfortable in continuing to teach all over the world those questions, but you still have a family. You still have a family. So what do you do with that?
What do you do with that? Yeah, I mean, I think what you're describing is, I don't know, it's maybe as if when I say vulnerability, you hear, there's certainly a connotation perhaps of weakness that's in there. Whereas when I think about vulnerability, and I can say this very genuinely, I think about it as strength and generosity. That's the way I understand. To me, the vulnerability was about invitation and opening. And in as much as I think we can agree that not everybody invites or is open, I put that word vulnerability on it because, because it feels like a generous risk that you're taking on behalf of the person you're offering or inviting or opening toward.
That's so interesting what you're saying, because you're right. I might not have been aware of that, but perhaps there was this easy and lazy association of vulnerability with weakness, but not to appear as weak. But I think that now that you're raising this, I think that pursuing, higher education or getting, a PhD or being tenured could be seen as a search for strength, some kind of strength, and then that will take us to some of the things that we have decided to talk about, some kind of legitimacy and authority, some kind of, things that I had to make up for because of particular circumstances, personal and more general, if we're inscribed in this African diaspora. So maybe the degree, maybe this public recognition was, some kind of lust for, strength. And I didn't understand it that way until you spoke. So maybe that was my association with, weakness, and not that I did not want to appear as weak, but perhaps failing to understand that I was looking for some type of strength, some type of security. And now the assessment is that the degree and the citizenship within, worldwide academia has not brought any strength, any security. It has not. So other ways.
I think, when you were describing the fact that, earlier in the earlier part of the presentation, you needed these things, this book couldn't have been written 20 years earlier. And you named some of those explicit indicators of legitimacy and authority that created a context where you felt safe enough, strong enough, whatever word you want to use there, to put this story that had been there but hadn't been yet on paper into the world. It made me think also, even just translating as something that has, been something that I was only able to do after certain legitimacy and authority. So I guess, and one of the words from my context, the context that I think through a lot is this idea of marronage, like marooning.
Yes.
And not so much marooning as like revolution and escape, but marooning as negotiation and figuring out, okay, I want to do things differently, but I still exist within a context that has a scale of value, a value and evaluation that I'm subject to.
Yes.
And so as we move through the profession, as we draw on the strength of those who are our colleagues, our collaborators, you're constantly negotiating with this box that contains you to figure out how much of who you are you can hold on to and maintain and do honor to, while at the same time behaving in ways that enable you to be recognized within the box. It's never a comfortable fit. I feel it like a body that's constantly in motion, right? You're not settled. And I think that too, in this idea of the untranslatable, the unsettled, how do you not experience that as frustration, sadness, disappointment, or rage, which are all very legitimate responses to that conundrum. But how do you then find like-minded or like-feeling colleagues, collaborators, friends that you can sit in that with and experience and create out of, right? And again, this is part of what we've been, at one point we were thinking through the metaphor, what if each of these key words, vulnerability, legitimacy, authority, we have also like freedom, obviously Blackness, diaspora, mother tongue, if those words were these like stones that we dropped in a pond and we'd be interested in the circles that resonate out of them.
Yes.
But that, again, it's like that frequency, that movement, that shifting to adjust to a thing that's never going to allow you to feel perfectly settled or fit, but that you can accept. And again, in partnership, in conversation, in collaboration, in efforts at translation, you can accept being there and occupying that space more and more, maybe.
That's exactly the translation of the loophole of retreats we've just done.
Okay. Well, there we go. Is someone recording this?
I have an audio.
Are you also? Okay.
I'm doing audio recording, so I can share it with. That's the loophole of retreats. That is being explored, drawing from Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. And that's the title that the artist Simone Lee is using for her upcoming participation to the Venice Biennale. And that's also an event that took place just a few years ago at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, the Loophole of Retreat. About, to me, it's really about making do with whatever circumstances you find yourself trapped in, understanding that you can never fully escape, understanding that you have to not only survive, you can also hope to thrive, and you have to find ways. And this triggers, or this prompts, or this makes mandatory creativity. Creativity. If yes, of course, if you're marooning, not if you're comfortable with the space that you're inhabiting and you just want to be part of that. If you're still in disagreement with that space, with those circles, with these ivory towers, then you are indeed a maroon, and you'll have to find ways, and you'll always be aware of the short-lived, of the non-permanent, on the constant evolution. And you'll always play with that, because there's no way out. Totally out. And you don't want the way in.
Right. I think one of Maboula and my common ancestors, and we're thinking about how explicitly and implicitly to weave her presence through these conversations, is Maryse Condé, who I'm sure many of you here are familiar with, who is at the nexus of our coming together.
Yes.
She didn't do it on purpose, but she did create this synergy out of just being who she is. And since then, Maboula and I have both been we haven't mentored her, we've been menteed, we're mentees. She has mentored us, there we go. She has been a mentor to each of us in different ways. We have collaborated on celebrating her in different ways, both in public events and in writing. But one of the things that's most important in her practice, and anyone who knows her knows this, is this idea of creativity being born of disorder. And I think those are words that figure into what we're trying to do going forward as well. I think we're getting signs that there's questions, and time is about time to open it up for questions. We've got a back channel going, so.
Yes, but you're right, Kaiama. Maryse is the one who put us in connection. I met Maryse after the first, academic exchange, the student exchange. And when we met in her classroom, that was like 1 or 2 years after that. And
yes,
this has been perhaps the longest continuous relationship. It was, so does it have to do with the fact that she was a woman, that she was a free woman? I mean, how, I don't know. I don't know what shaped this ongoing conversation. That
she was definitely a maroon. She was a Black woman, a Guadeloupean woman. She was a writer in the academy, teaching theory. Like, she was so adamantly pushing against the boxes in such a clear way. In that way, I think a vulnerability that I mean as strength. So. Yeah.
Maboula and Kaiama, this was so fascinating. I feel like I have so many questions, and I hope more will come from our audience. But maybe just bouncing on what you just said, Kaiama, speaking about Maryse Condé and her pushing the boxes. I was interested in, Maboula, you said something sort of in passing when you started this conversation about how this book would not have been possible at an earlier date. in your biography, in your trajectory. And one of the things that you mentioned is that you could not have written this book without the security of being a tenured professor in the French academic context. And I know that when we started discussing, scheduling this event within Black History Month, you were very interested and keen on having a Black History Month in a French context. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about how you're pushing the boundaries in France, about what conversations are possible.
That's a great question, Séverine. Thank you so much. I think pushing the boundaries in France is not something that I set to do. It's not something that I set to do. It's something that, that I was faced with in light of what I had in mind, what I was hoping to do, what I wanted to do, and that was simply deemed impossible and unacceptable on so many occasions throughout my life, since being a student to this day. So it means that early on, already in my 20s, I understood that my interests and the general interests simply were in contradiction. And it's as if you realize that your own life, or the control you want to have in your life, over your life, or the orientation you want to give to your life, happen to be the embodiment of what is not presented as acceptable in this country. And it's okay. Now, I've understood that. I've understood that in the security of, paradoxically, of US academia, US academia filled with people from all over the world. Sometimes we mistake from France, US academia as like this very United States of America thing, as if the entire world, or professors of multiple and very varied origins, did not somehow find some type of solace within US academia, right? Which doesn't make the United States of America as a nation state a more just society or more open society. But within academia, there has been space, right? So there has been space for the Maryse Condé, for the Edouard Glissant, from all the other people that I've studied with or met with. Colin Palmer was originally from Jamaica, right? Barnard College, who's now at Northwestern, is I think his family is from Jamaica, but he was raised and educated in Britain, right? And he's part of those Black British scholars who have come to the US. Peter Hudson is from Canada. Jemima Pierre, her family is from Haiti, and she's at UCLA, all those things. So the fact that perhaps I have grown more aware of the configuration, and I have grown more, I have accepted the game and the rules, and I still decide to maroon, as I was going to say Jamaica, as Kaiama said.
Okay, my new nickname is Jamaica in this context. That's cool.
Okay. Now, so I still decide that I'm in total disagreement with those rules, and that if I am the embodiment of the, of this unwelcomed disorder, then what can I do? What can I do? But I want to insist on the fact that it's not something that I set to do. Mm-hmm. I didn't, view myself as, I'm going to do this. I thought I was free until I was, shown that I wasn't. So I wasn't free, or when I wanted to write a dissertation on the Nation of Islam and Rastafari in Jamaica. This is not something that you do. This is not interesting scholarship. This is not legitimate scholarship. Mm-hmm. This will not make you a doctor. This is not knowledge that is valued. Mm-hmm. So these were the first questions. How come? Why? Don't the Rastafari of Jamaica matter? Isn't reggae music that has been fueled with Rastafari ideology and spirituality? Isn't it great music that the whole world has consumed and absorbed and adored and copied and exploited, right? Isn't there something to say about that? Isn't it interesting to look at the Nation of Islam and see that throughout history, this is one of the African American organizations that has had the capacity to gather the largest numbers of African Americans, despite what we think of the Nation of Islam. Despite what we think of them, there is this power of mobilization that is unique. And there's a story behind that, right? So, and aren't Black people of interest? And I am a Black person. So little by little, I decided to stand firm, and that's what can be seen as as radical in the French context. But this is not how I view it. This is not how I view it.
It's interesting because what you're saying makes me think of a remark you made earlier. And I actually thought, I mean, one of my questions was going to be to Kaiama about how did she go from Le Triangle et l'Hexagone to Black is the Journey, Africana the Name. I mean, I was really like, this says, I've been meaning to ask this question. And so it was really fascinating to hear that it also kind of, really emanated from you, Maboula. And because it's this very poetic title. I mean, one may expect something else than, an academic book. And from everything that you say, I feel very much, and so please correct me if I'm wrong, but in some ways that you're really stretching the boundaries of academia, and you talked about legitimacy of objects of study and of knowledge. And so, and then through your partnership with Kaiama, you're saying, okay, you're going beyond academia and integrating the translation work as part of your research and scholarship. And then from translation, you're now working on the untranslatable. So there's really a deep investigation into what it means to produce scholarship and work and how. And then after mentioning the untranslatable, you were talking a lot about embodiment, vulnerability, trust, allies, family, intimacy. And so, yeah, it just, I mean, like, I feel like I'm fast. I want to see what other work you're going to do together, because it seems like a journey in and of itself.
Yeah.
But maybe Kaiama, I guess that wasn't really a question. That was just like my fascinated remark about what you're doing. But Kaiama, I would be interested, because that's always something that I think people like to hear about a little bit more, is, in the process of translating this work, how, you talked about, one of the challenges is, translating into a different context. And so how what were the challenges of the different context, and how are, Africana and diaspora studies, similar or different in France and the United States?
Those are actually sneakily a bunch of different questions pretending to be one, but I will, or at least there are at least two questions. I'll go with the second part of what you just mentioned, because it picks up on something that Maboula was saying in terms of, what I'm translating as, sometimes you are compelled to create the space you need. And I would say that one of the major differences between the question of Africana studies in the US versus in France is that there are Africana studies in the US, whereas there are not, basically, in France. And so that meant a couple of things for me as a translator. I will say it meant something to me personally, having been, and I know some of my colleagues here at Barnard are in the audience, having watched the journey of Africana at this institution, for example, from something that was a pretty thin, barely populated, unrun program 20-something years ago, through becoming a robust program in the last 10 years to becoming this powerhouse of a model of a department in a major institution in the US, 20 years later, is a journey that I've been on, that I've seen. And so to relive the frustrations and the anticipations and the hopefulness that's present throughout Maboula's book from the French context was something that I brought to the translation, sort of like a deep well of knowledge and emotion around what the story that she was telling. But a couple of more maybe logistical things, and this was helpful to be in conversation with Maboula. There are certain references that Maboula makes throughout. They're not exactly puns or jeux de mots, but there are some of those in there that are like straight out of contemporary Black French culture that had to be reinscribed. And we tried to keep footnotes to a minimum, but reimagined in an American context. Like, how do you get the emotion or the joke that works in Black France to work in an Afro-diasporic Anglophone context? So that would be one thing. And I'd say another element or another maybe challenge to the translation was, I mentioned this earlier, her I, like the fact that there is this first person at the heart of this narrative that I'm sort of, like invasion of the body snatching my way into. It's not my I, but I'm writing it as an I, meant that I always had Maboula in my head. Like, how would she, like, how am I hearing her say this when I see her? How am I hearing, like, where did that idea come from? Because many of these ideas that are present in the book, she's been telling this story in various ways over the time that I've known her. And so getting the translation right also meant for me returning to those moments in time, returning to what I imagined were the source or the context for the claims she was making, and making sure that I did justice to them in the way that I related them. So I mentioned this again earlier, more than most translations that I've done, there was an intimacy there and a responsibility of a different order because of our relationship. So, yeah.
Sorry, if I may, Kaiama and Séverine, I think this is so important what you just shared, Kaiama, because this is precisely what I wanted. That is to say, even if I had the title in mind, I knew how I wanted it to sound. I was hearing it in my mind. I was clear about that, but I was not confident. I mean, I could have written it in English, but I wanted to have a native speaker. I wanted to have somebody. I wanted to have a Black woman and somebody I trust, and somebody who's got the knowledge and the mastery to be able to, to perform this translation, and who would be sensitive to those nuances that you have just mentioned, Kaiama. So that was it was not only about myself being capable of writing this in English. I wanted somebody sharing the kind of identical experience, not totally identical, but to occupy the body and the place of a Black woman within the Americas to deal with those questions. So to me, that also would contribute to enriching the book, and to that would contribute to furthering this Afro-diasporic conversation. What does some girl from the US, Black girl what does she have to say about this?
And what does it make her feel? Yeah.
I
Exactly.
feel like we have some interesting questions that have come in the chat. There's a question about how the book was received in the US versus in France, with academia.
Two people are asking that question, yeah.
And and then there's somebody else who's, saying how, it's important that we reclaim our individual freedom and liberties. And so that's an absolute, it's fundamental.
Someone has written a very lengthy, beautiful declaration of freedom, essentially, in the chat, and pointed out that Maboula and I have both talked about freedom as something toward which we are interested in moving in our practice. And this person wanted to say, or wanted to make the point that we start free, freedom is what we are. And I think there's a shade of nuance in, I don't think either Maboula or I doubt that we are inherently free, but there is still an aspiration, always an aspiration, I think, to greater freedom, but I would say also for freedom to be acknowledged, like for my freedom, for her, for our knowing of ourselves. And this returns to your point, Maboula. You didn't set out to be radical. You were compelled by the fact that your freedom was not in line or in alignment with the borders of what freedom looked like in your context. And that can't be ignored. So our freedom is absolute, but it's also in negotiation, I think. And we can't deny that. But yeah, but for this question of the reception, I think two people wanted to know that as well.
Yeah, so regarding the reception, it's very different in both contexts. In France, there was multiple layers. There was the, academic reception, and then, three layers: the academic reception, the mainstream reception, meaning the mainstream media and the mainstream channels of dissemination for these types of works. And then there was the circle of, activists or people who are mobilizing for, more open, contemporary discussions, public discussions around race, Blackness. And so these were the different types. So for the people who are into these types of conversations, it was a warm welcome. It was very warm. It was an expected book, and people were so happy. And we had a book launch that was beautiful, and it meant so much. But at the very emotional level for people, like, we've been waiting for this book. We're with you, and we love you, so that was great. When it comes to the mainstream reception, this begins to show the limitations of the conversation. We're still stuck on certain issues. What do you mean by race? Are you a Black woman? What do you mean by if you say you're a Black woman? Do you believe in universalism? We are a colorblind country. What do you mean? This is, oh my God, this happened to you when you were a student. This is horrible. This can't happen. This is not true. This is, or we don't care and ignorance. Or you should have spoken more about, your own research. I want to know more about Liberia, the Nation of Islam, Marcus Garvey. You should have quoted Papendiaï. And what about Norman Ajari? So to me, that was the proof of ignorance. I'm not getting too deep into some of the scholarly works that I mentioned, precisely to remind these types of readers that you don't know, that there are centuries of knowledge production over this topic, and you don't know. So I gave you, as Kaiama said at the beginning, this is why there are so few footnotes. I give you the names. I give you the works. You can go and read for yourself. I'm not teaching you here. I'm sharing knowledge. But then if you want to go into, I'm not going to reanalyze everything. This has been done. And I don't want also, I don't want to be, presented or understood as a kind of a pioneer. I'm not a pioneer. This book is published in 2020. Can you imagine? We could go back to 1920, 1820, 1720, 1620, 1520. Somebody said something somewhere. Somebody wrote it, somebody painted it, somebody prayed it, somebody ate it, somebody wore it, whatever it was. This conversation is old, right? So I'm not going to educate you unless you're taking my classes, right? So, and then for the French academia, it depends. There are younger scholars who are really interested in what I do and who've been following me and who've, who support my work, who have invited me. People from my generation also who are within academia. It's not that many of us who are doing things and paying attention to that. But the book also poses a structural question. Is it for professors and students of English departments? Is it for contemporary French history or sociology departments? Like, who needs it? Where does it fit? I've also noticed that in bookstores, the categorization of the book changes all the time. Sometimes it's in sociology. Sometimes it's in literature.
Wow.
Sometimes it's in essay. You know, it's weird. I don't know how they categorize, but most importantly, I don't even know where I would put it in a bookstore. And I'm not interested in that. I want it to be in bookstores, but I don't think that any of those you know, categories fit anyway. But it's not always the same categorization. On the other hand, you know, in the United States, the book has been taken so seriously, and this is where the ease and I don't know, the comfort come into play. This is you know, Zooms like today where I discuss my work with my translator, and we have you know, deep questions. We surprise one another. We get to think collectively as we speak. I've received invitations where people have told me or asked me about punctuation in the book. And this is a level of analysis or level of reading that we still don't commonly have in France. Because in France, we're still stuck in that very political moment where when it still means something for a Black woman to be speaking publicly. You know, like this is a Black woman speaking and she's wearing dreadlocks and she grew up in a project, and we're still there. So sometimes we don't have the time or the luxury or the privilege to go into, you know, how the book works, what it says, or how, as I said earlier, I'm always surprised when Kaiama will make remarks about the book. And I'm surprised because I trust her literary skills, and she's taking the book seriously. And that makes me feel so good. But we don't have that privilege of level of analysis in France. We don't. So everything is always really, really great, really, you know, highly valued, highly even financially valued in the United States. France is always more or less volunteer work. You don't get paid for this kind of work. And people read it, have questions, and have very fine analysis, and we talk comfortably, and then we go to dinner, and everything is good. And that could have been it. I didn't know that was radical. I didn't know that was I don't know, avant-garde. I didn't know.
There's that when you were talking about reception, especially among the French, I couldn't help but think of that somewhat cheesy quote, you know, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. You know, like, you're not ready. If you're not ready, you know, the teacher can't stand there waiting until you are ready to hear the lesson. But when you are ready, here I am. Like, you can read the book and this is your invitation. But until that time,
exactly,
you know, our time is precious.
Exactly,
right? Like, our emotional energy is precious. These are resources we have.
They're supposed to catch up, but there's this lingering arrogance. So you cannot know more than they do. And if you know more, or if you're talking about something that is not known or widely circulated, then it's your responsibility to even, you know, teach them so that they can, you know, catch up and then become the masters of the topic. For things that you have worked on, you know, for over 20 years.
Right.
What does that mean?
Right.
I need to plug my computer.
Yeah. I mean, you've left me speechless, because I feel want to take you into my living room, my office, and continue this conversation for a very long time. But I appreciated so much, I mean, hearing you both, and I think that's really the objective of this Entre Nous series. I mean, every time we bring on speakers, it's just this closeness, this proximity, and I'm delighted with the questions, very engaged questions that we've received from our audience, which show how attentively they followed us. Maboula, you're talking about that you're leaving. Maboula is what at the show is.
I was trying to be discreet. No,
what were we saying about time?
No, I needed to plug my computer because I was at 3%, so it could have been even more tragic. No, not even. I'm too short. I couldn't reach without getting up. Sorry. Yes.
No. But no, I was just saying how how you've left me speechless and how I could continue this for a very long time. I'll just thank you both profoundly and invite our audience, if they're interested, to follow us in our next conversation, which will be taking place on April 4th at the American Library in person. And Maboula and Kaiama, do let us know when you're in Paris. We'd love to have you.
I'm in Paris right now.
And I'll get there sometime.
Well, Monday.
Yeah, but I just got back. Séverine, I just got back.
Okay.
But
thank you both for the conversation, and thank you everyone for the questions and for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Hello, Yvette. I saw your name. I didn't know you were here.
Julia's here. Yvette, Laurent.
Bonjour, Laurent. Thank you, Séverine, for this. Also for this invitation, because to me this is also a part of the US in Paris, so that's even more convenient. But this is the part of the type of spaces that allows for this type of conversation. So that's much appreciated and very precious to me.
And here I have to actually pay tribute to the Paris Global Center Director, Dr. Brunhilde Biebuck.
Yes, Brun.
Yes, I think she's following us right now. And she says that the Global Center in Paris, Colombia's presence in Paris, is really creating a third space, because it's not the United States, it's not France. We're trying to find new voices between the two. So
exactly, and I also remember Lauren Wolf, who invited me many times when she was at the center, and I'm also grateful for that. So these are the great spots. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kaiama, for your scholarship and your friendship. And yes, we'll speak soon. Kaiama keeps me in check. She's very thorough.
The train's running. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.